I'm still getting so many architectural photography questions from you guys, and that is absolutely fab. I'm loving it. So I thought what I'd do is just freestyle record my screen and just have a chat with you guys as I work through some photos that I took many years ago. In fact, let's have a little look over here. Can we see the date these were shot? There we go, 28th of April 2010. So these photos are now over a decade old. And currently I'm working on putting together a new portfolio, which is kind of funny. But what I was also doing is I'm going through my old shots, looking at that, and I'll just flick through a few of these shots as I chat to you. I'm going through old work, looking whether there's anything I can learn from those old shoots, see what I do differently these days, and then I can actually get that information to you guys on the channel. So if you do want to learn more about architectural photography, how you can get shots like this, please subscribe to the channel, because I'm going to be sharing all about what I've learned in well over a decade in shooting architecture, and share it all freely with you guys. So one of the first things I'd like to bring to your attention is pretty much the mess of my structure folder over here. So I've got JPEGs over here, I've got portraits I took of the architects involved on the day as well. Then I've got this folder, raw, batch, 3 batch, 5 batch, 7 batch. What does that even mean? That was actually my way of collecting the photos that I had, 7 different exposures that I wanted to bring together in HDR software, or sometimes I shot 9 different exposures. I have since over the years actually culled out a lot of that information, so I don't have a full set of imagery to work with anymore, and some of those images I then created TIFFs, if I remember rightly, because this is how I used to work back in the day. I would just automate all of my HDR, throw it into whatever software I was using at the time, and sometimes it did okay job of that, sometimes not so good. So things like this, for example, this isn't processed in any way other than bringing those HDR shots together, and you can see that we still have a really bright hot spot on the table here, on the kitchen bench top, sorry, and we've also got a really strong blue cast. Those kind of things I would fix after I'd actually created the HDR. Nowadays I work in a much different way. If you follow my work, you'll know that I do a lot of luminosity blending now, because you get a much better result. And if I am doing HDR work, which I find is a much quicker and more effective way to work sometimes, because I use Aurora, and that creates a really nice believable image straight out of the software without having to do any additional processing. So what we're going to do here is just look at some of these old images and just see if I can't salvage some of these for the portfolio, and if I see anything that I've learned along the way or anything I can talk about with you guys, I'll share that in this video as well. Now, this architect has created some really beautiful pieces of architecture over the years, and I've done pretty much all of his photography for him. So we've worked together, got a really good working relationship. He's a really great guy, and yeah, like I say, he does some great work, so it's really nice to be involved with his projects. You can see I'm not shooting with a tilt shift lens. I'm using my trusty 16 to 35mm that I've been using for years, and the reason that I haven't upgraded to a tilt shift lens is because I love the speed of working with a 16 to 35 zoom lens. It's so quick, but it can still give me the results equivalent to using a tilt shift lens. So let me just show you how I work with something like that. After you've enabled the profile correction, and so we've got nice straight lines, I simply come into the transform section, and I always use the guided transform nowadays, and I pick 2 lines, one on the far right and one as far left as I can. So this is a what should be a straight line here. I could use this, but I prefer, if I can, to get a longer strip, so it just sort of minimizes any variance that you might get. So we try and get that nice and straight there. And so straight away we've got nice straight verticals, but our horizontal is not straight. So what I would normally do is probably just come in and just straighten out our horizontals as well. And let's look for the horizontal line there. Nice little line running across the garage. And that has changed all of the perspective, all of the geometry, and so I'm losing some of my shot there. But if I scale back, what I can come in and do is just crop this in, because where you get to the edge of the frames when you've done a pretty extreme transformation like that, things will get a little bit warped and distorted. But what I like to do is just take the best of the frame, where the distortion is minimal. So if I double click that, we've got a much cleaner representation of the geometry of the architecture. And if I flick back to before and after, we've just straightened all those lines up and it's looking much better. But I do always struggle when you have a little runoff on the concrete itself, just so water runs away from the house. That obviously runs at a slightly different angle to the correct horizon line, and that can just play with your eyes a little bit, just mess with your head. So just be mindful of that. This is a shot these days where I would get at least 3 exposures, probably 5, just to make sure that I'd got all of the detail and the highlights to bring back. But one way to quickly correct a single exposure like this, or at least get close, it's not going to be as good as shooting different exposures, but what we can do is do localized changes. So make a little gradient in there and just reduce the exposure just inside the foyer area there. We could do the same over the lighting area here. We can just talk into the highlights and just drop those down and just tone that back. We could create a darkening gradient through the sky here and just sort of bring the exposure down because this was an evening shot. Bring the highlights down as well, and as you saw, we've dragged this over the top of the building as well, and we don't really want it affecting the building, just the sky. So a really easy way to deal with that is just come into the range mask, and what we can do is select the color option, and we're just going to select the blues. So rather than just clicking on one blue, which gives you an acceptable range mask, what I prefer to do is actually click and drag, so we're getting a full range right through there, and you get a much smoother transition doing that. We're also quite dark on the side of the building here, so what I can also do is come in, select us another radial mask and just drag that over nice and big. We're feathering off from the center at 100% to 0 at the edge. If I hover my mouse over there, you'll see in red what that looks like. And now what I can do is just boost the exposure up in this zone, potentially even the shadows as well. And as we're getting brighter, the blacks are being brought up as well. So I'll just bring those down ever so slightly to control that area. Normally I wouldn't dive in and start working in the way I have done. I would normally be coming first of all into the profile and selecting an appropriate camera matching profile. And I'll normally be going for a profile which is as neutral as possible, and that then allows me to just control the contrast myself. Rather than the profile bringing in a whole load of contrast and having a very strong, punchy, high dynamic range, I like to minimize the dynamic range as much as I can in the file, and then that gives me the ability to play with these sliders and bring out the contrast exactly as I like. Nowadays, I will export these into Photoshop and do one last quick edit in Photoshop, and then as my finishing, I'll also just run a really quick, simple AI filter over the top just with Luminar AI, and that just gives it a really nice finishing punch to it as well. But just for now, just sticking in Lightroom, what I'm going to do is just clean up some of these leaves, and I'll do that just with the spot removal tool in the heal mode, and then literally just click on some of these leaves, and then Lightroom is going to go and figure out where it should be best sampling from to replace that with some concrete. I'm not a big fan of using this tool in Lightroom, and I would be much happier just doing this retouch in Photoshop. But that is one way to work. Now, just seeing these photos just to the right here in the set, we've got 1, 2, 3, a dark, a medium, and a bright. Back in the day when I shot this, Lightroom didn't have this option, but basically we can actually create a merged HDR version of these photos. All we need to do is right click, come to Photo Merge and HDR, or you could use the hotkey Control H. And now we just let Lightroom do its calculations, and we've got the deghosting option on, so anything that changes from shot to shot, it's actually going to mask those areas out. And I'm not quite sure why these areas would have been changing, to be honest, because I would have shot this on a tripod as far as I'm aware. So I'm going to reduce the deghosting amount to low, and we're just going to click merge. We are going to, we'll auto align them. I can't be sure that I didn't bump the tripod. Come on, this was over 10 years ago now. Auto settings, I don't want to do. I want to control all of that myself. I'm going to create a stack based on these 3 images with a new version on top, and I'm just going to click merge. And what that's going to do is just give me a DNG file that has more of that dynamic range to work with. So there we go. This is the merged file that we see in front of us here. And currently it doesn't look that good. And a few people have been asking me in my comments about HDR and why don't you just merge it in Lightroom? One of the things you need to remember when you're creating an HDR file inside of Lightroom is What Lightroom creates for you is not actually an HDR finished image. All it's doing is actually putting all of the data that existed in the original photos into one photo, and it's then up to you to use the sliders to actually control that information. So I can bring the highlights down, I can bring the shadows up. You still need to actually make your adjustments to bring out the best in that file. And that is why oftentimes I'll say Aurora is the best option, particularly for things like real estate where you need a really quick turnaround and you don't want to be spending too much time going in, messing around in Lightroom. You just want to get the stuff turned around quickly. Aurora is going to give you the best value in terms of your time investment and getting a good result back. I'll put a link to Aurora in the description below because I've got a discount code which is @Sky10 that you guys are welcome to use. And if you're doing this professionally, the cost of the software, which I'm not sure off the top of my head, but I don't believe it's over $100, you're going to make that money back many times over through your career. So even just one photo shoot, you've covered the cost of that software and then some, so it's well worth getting hold of. But for now, we're just going to stay in Lightroom for this particular edit and what I'm dealing with here. So I'm just going to actually boost things up, just play with this dynamic range and just try and bring out the best of this file. Before I start making too many other changes, I just want to get my exposure right, and now I can just bring down those highlights, bring the blacks back down. Just want to make sure that we've got a nice level of contrast going on in this photo. It's just a little bit of a dance between the different sliders until you get the look you like. So using the / key, I'm just going to show our before and our after. Before, after, it's just about bringing back some of that detail, because obviously the architect wants to see all of the detail that he's put into the home, and you're then free to still come in and do things like I was showing you before, which is just to add radial filters, things like that, just to dull down some of the highlights. I wonder whether we've got any detail in the sky to bring this up from a pure pitch black. Yes, we do. So let's bring that just over the sky. In fact, if we bring it over the house, what we can do is what we did before, add a range mask and just come in and grab the color that we want to boost up. So that's the blues. And did you see straight away, it just took that effect off of the house. So now we have a blue sky, which we didn't before. So if I go to before, pure black, now we've got our blue sky. Another thing that I like to do is actually come in and work specifically with certain colors. So in this instance, we've got a very orange panel here, and I know, well, I think at least this was supposed to be a white panel. It's just been lit by one of the external lights. So we can come into the color section here, just jump into oranges, grab it and start to desaturate it. But the problem we've got is as I drop that down, you see the wood in the top left corner, it's also reducing that. So that's one of those times where my edit in Photoshop, I'd be able to come in and better mask out an adjustment like that. But another way to handle this would be to actually just paint over it, and we can paint over it with a desaturation. So I'll just click and start painting here. And I can see that my flow is pretty low, but I could do this a little quicker for you guys, but there we go. You get the idea. We could also bring the temperature to the left as well, so that's just neutralizing as well. So I could do a much more refined mask on that, to be honest. If I were in Photoshop, I would actually mask out this little shadow of whatever that is as well. But like I say, staying in Lightroom just for now. Just clean up some of those leaves as well. And something I will always do is come in and do my transformation, and more often than not I'll be working with the guided lines, so I can control exactly where I want to draw those lines. I can do one there and I can do one down this face here, and just like that we have corrected that area there. I feel like we've got a little bit too much foreground here, so I think we'll do a little bit of a crop here. We could go all Instagram on this and go for a 4:5 crop. And potentially there's another image I could put into the portfolio. Little things like the weird color balance we've got going on inside there. The cyan, it's just a little bit odd. I mean, I could come in and try and correct it. I can grab the cyan, reduce the saturation, maybe even in the greens as well, just reduce that. There you go. That's where that color tone was living, in the greens. So we'll just take that out. So oftentimes just jumping into the color tab here is a really good way to just jump in and talk into particular color casts that you've got going on and just remove or at least minimize those. The guided transform tool is really powerful. If you look at an image like this, for example, So this is a really good example of something that I blatantly shot 10 years ago. This is not how I would shoot this today. I would make sure that at the very least my horizon line was squared off and parallel to the true horizon line, but we can correct this. So when I actually shot this, my intention was to correct this in post-production. If you were shooting this with a tilt shift lens, you would be able to get these lines nice and straight. But if you don't have a tilt shift lens, you have to shoot it with the knowledge that you're coming into post-production and correcting it later. So let's see what we can do. I'm going to do a full edit. I'm going to do a real quick full walkthrough on this. So the first thing I'm going to do is select a camera matching profile. We'll go for the neutral one. From there, I work top down with this exception. I come in and I remove the chromatic aberration and I enable profile correction. And you'll see as soon as I do that, the barrel distortion that we had before, that is gone. But we still have the anomalous perspective going on. So we're going to grab the guided tool here. And let me just say, back in the old day, before we had the guided tool, the way I used to work would be just to play with the vertical slider like this until I thought the verticals were pretty good. And then I'd get the horizontal slider and work with that as well. And then you might need to rotate it like this. And by doing that, you can get it pretty straight by tweaking, going back and forth between these sliders. But it's a pretty cumbersome way to work. So I'm going to hold the Alt or Option key on the Mac, and I'm going to click Reset Transform. And now I'm going to use my preferred method, which is now using the guided tool. So we'll select the guides, choose an area which is as far to the right as we possibly can. And there's one, and then probably the furthest I can go to the left to get a nice straight line, or what should be straight, is the edge of this door frame here. And so I'll draw another line down there. So now we've got our vertical sorted, and that is the very least you need to do. You may say, I'm happy with the verticals being straight, and because the camera's turned to the right, I want that to look like that in the photo, but I prefer for architects to get everything as square as possible. So if I can correct the horizontals as well as the verticals, I'm going to do that. And look at what a difference we've got there. So people say, oh, you need to get a tilt shift lens and shoot with a tilt shift lens. If your budget doesn't allow for a tilt shift lens, then you can work around it with the lens that you have. When I originally shot this, I do believe I had a set of at least 5, maybe 7 exposures, and that would have allowed me to bring back the detail outside of the door here and also in the reflection. But unfortunately, in my infinite wisdom, at some point over the last decade, I decided that I didn't need those photos anymore. Just one would do. I thought, I'm never going to come back to these photos, but here I am. So for me, that's an important takeaway, is archive your work. Just back it up, buy a cheap hard drive if you need to, and once you've delivered your work to your client, just make sure it's backed up there. I actually run a 24 terabyte NAS, network attached storage, that has 6 drives inside of it, 6 4 terabyte drives, and that backs up my work continually with redundancy. I also have secondary drives that I back up to as well. And I brought that system in probably about 6 or 7 years ago, but 10 years ago or 11 years ago when I shot this, I didn't have that. But I strongly recommend archiving your work, particularly all of your old RAW files, and that just allows you the option to go back in, re-edit stuff, even if it's just for you and your own portfolio. Another thing I would have done when I actually shot this nowadays, which I couldn't do back then, was because I didn't have a light strong enough, but I would now use the Godox AD600 that I use regularly, because that is a super powerful light, and that would actually enable me to overpower the sun and actually get rid of all these little annoying hotspots. Like visually, for me, they are an annoyance and I don't like them at all. But they are here in this photo, so we'll press on. I'm going to bring the scale of this down slightly just so I can see whether I've got any more scope for bringing in a little bit of edge here. Did you see before, when I reset this, you can see that the wood goes right to the edge of the frame there, whereas what I want to do is actually include some of the exposed aggregate just so that we see that edge. So if I bring the scale down again, you start to see that exposed aggregate there. So now what I can do is bring my crop in, bring it to the left and double click. And now this is where I'll just jump back to the top and show you the sort of normal process I'd go through. The first thing I want to do is make sure I have a neutral color temperature. So if I know something should be a neutral color, and particularly if I've got daylight and tungsten mixing, I'll normally come somewhere between the two so that we're color balancing, not necessarily just for the daylight, but a little bit of that as well. So if we click there, we're kind of getting the best of both worlds or thereabouts. That's close enough for this example. And then I'll play with the exposure, get that where I want it. And the contrast I'll jump back to after I've done my highlight adjustment, brought my shadows up, played with the whites if I want to, and the blacks as well. And I can see on my histogram, that's where I'll keep an eye on for my whites and my blacks. If I'm not touching the left of the histogram with the blacks, I'll just bring that slider down until I am. Normally, I like to add just a bit of clarity to my architectural work. You can normally add a fair bit of clarity compared to what you could do with if you were working on a portrait, for example. If you do add clarity, normally the blacks will actually need to come back up just a smidge. The vibrance and saturation, you might want to bring those up. Depends on your camera, your profile, and your look for your architecture. I don't normally bring those up too far. I will sometimes come in and do an adjustment with my curve, my tone curve, but normally if I'm exporting this into Photoshop for my final retouching, I will normally make those final adjustments to the contrast in Photoshop itself. I'm going to jump into the color section. Sometimes if I have a sky outside and it's blown out, what I'll do is come to the luminance of the blue and just bring that down and just see if I can bring back any detail in the sky. In this case, I can't. All it's doing is creating a weird hue going on in this reflection here. So I'm not going to worry about that. The fact that I haven't got detail outside the property here, I don't actually think it's that relevant for this shot. So I'm not going to lose sleep over it. I will probably need to bring in a bit of sharpening, but let's have a look. It's not too bad. We're at Lightroom's default of 40 at the moment. For architecture, I normally push this again a little further than I would for normal portraits, things like that. And depending on the size of your sensor, depends on how much radius you want to bring in. And I believe this was shot on the D800, and so that's a 36 megapixel camera, and yeah, radius of about 1.2 seems to work quite nicely. So if I turn this off, and we see the soft look that you get straight off of the sensor, and then reintroduce that, and all of a sudden we've got a lot more detail going on, and that's quite nice. Sometimes I bring in a bit of noise reduction for the luminance, particularly if I've had to boost the shadows up quite a bit. And we can leave everything else here alone. And the last thing that I like to do is just control the viewer's eye by controlling those bright spots. So, and do excuse me in my throat and my voice here, because I was watching the England against Italy final in the Euros earlier, and there was a lot of screaming and shouting going on for me. Congratulations, Italy, by the way. I'm deeply saddened being an Englishman, but well done to Italy. They deserved the win. So enough said about that. Right, back to this edit. I see a little hot spot on the floor here where the sun's come through. I've already said about how I would try and correct that in camera with my own light on site. I would probably bounce the light up onto this ceiling just behind me and get that to flood in and fill this area in. I would still shoot my natural bracketed set as I've got here, or at least one of them here, but I would shoot a bracketed set of 5, potentially 7 to bring down the high contrast of outside the window here. And I would be combining the best of those sets inside of Photoshop. But with this adjustment here, what I'm going to do is not desaturate it, but actually reduce the exposure and also bring down the whites as well, probably bring down the highlights. And the only place that we really want to bring down this detail is just on this little hot spot here. So how do we do that? Well, we looked at color masks before within the range mask. This time what I'm going to do is a luminance mask, and that just allows us to say only affect a bright area or a dark area. So we want to just affect the bright area down here. So what I'm going to do is leave the bright point where it is, and I'm just going to get the shadow bit and say don't affect the shadows, and I start bringing this up until we see that effect fall away from those darker bits around the edge. And look at that, we need to take it all the way up there to get that effect. You can then play with the smoothness to see what you want to do with your transition, but normally that midpoint is about where I normally find it's pretty good. And then from there, if we want to bring the exposure down even further, we can do that. And as I've done that, we've got a more orangey look to the wood here. So in fact, I will come back to that saturation slider and just bring that down just so that this part of the wood seems to match this side better. And on this side it was a bit brighter, so I'm just going to try and create a sense of uniformity in terms of brightness across this panel of wood. I'm going to bring the temperature up on this side because this is getting more affected by daylight on that right hand side, so that had more of a bluey tone. And I think everything else is looking pretty good, although underneath here we are getting quite dark because obviously this area is more in shadow. So what I'm going to do is create a nice big round radius there and just boost the exposure up and the shadows and just tweak these until I feel happy with that. Normally when I'm boosting up these dark shadowy areas, what I'll need to do just to keep the contrast looking nice and crunchy is just grab the black slider and sort of bring that back down. And I'll normally grab my effect that I've created and just move it off, move it back, and just sort of visually just keep an eye on what's going on here. And if I like it, I like it. What a stupid thing to say. If I like it, I like it. Of course, if I like it, I like it. Oh, it's been a long day. So now we've done that, let's have a quick look at our before and after. So here is our before. We've got a very wonky blue cast looking image here with hot spots on the floor, on the walls, and here's our edit that we're going to send through to the architect, and I believe he's going to be much happier with this image. I say going to send through to the architect. This job was done a long time ago. I don't need to send this to the architect at all. This is just me playing around with it potentially for my portfolio, and as I'm talking to you, this is often what I do. I make refinements as I look at my image again. I think, okay, what else do I want to do? You got to draw the line somewhere, but I was finding that foreground was a little bit too bright, so I've just darkened this foreground down just a little bit, just so that our eye leads more into this more interesting focal point around the door here. Okay, let's go again with our before and after, guys. Here we go. Ready? Before. Oh dear, this is not a good capture. And after. Okay, we've salvaged it with post-production. Before and after. Anyway, guys, that's it for this video. Do subscribe if you want to learn more about architecture, because I have been going back through my whole back catalogue and it is amazing how much I've learned in 10 years. Yeah, mind-blowing. I thought I knew a lot when I was getting started with architectural photography because I've been doing other photography for a long time as well. But just within this particular niche genre, I've learned so much and I just want to share that with you guys. So if you're interested, go ahead and subscribe, and if you're in any way grateful for me putting this video together, do me a favor and just leave me a comment. It means the world to me, and I am going to go and rest my poor weary voice. Thanks for watching, guys. I'll see you in the next one. Bye for now.